Hey folks, welcome back to another bonus episode of Season 4. This is the second part of our interview with husband and wife reporting duo Paul Fitzgerald and Elizabeth Gould. Last we left them, they were being chastised by one-time U.S. Army colonel turned Mujahideen advocate Karen McKay.
And so one day we get the phone rings and it's Karen McKay. And she said, I've never seen a piece of Soviet propaganda, blatant Soviet propaganda, so clearly run on American television. How dare you? So I said to myself, really? I said, Karen, do you really know what's going on in Afghanistan? And so I said, I've read some of your stuff, actually. She said, I represent the freedom fighters, da-da-da-da-da. So she said, why don't you sign on with us and you can come along and I'll make the contacts and we'll get you back to, we'll get you the real story about what's really going on in Afghanistan. So I said, Karen, if you can do that, that would be absolutely great. I would love to get the other side of the story and take all the video that I've got and recombine it into a whole new documentary and show your side of the story versus the other side of the story. So needless to say, I never heard back from Karen on that particular issue. She did write me a letter a few weeks later and said that, she was very frustrated with her efforts at moving the U.S. government towards a more aggressive position in Afghanistan, which I thought to myself, how could you get more aggressive than what you're doing here?
And she was also very big in the chemical weapons charges against the Soviets in Afghanistan, right?
She said, you didn't put anything in there about the Soviets' use of toxic weapons. I mean, I've been finding all kinds of proof about that. So I said, I have looked at that. I said, we have a guy here locally at MIT who's spent, a lot of time investigating some of the evidence that you presented. And, he's very skeptical about some of this stuff. She says, well, why should you be skeptical? She's the Washington Post and the New York Times have accepted my view of what's going on. Why can't you? That was the way she put it. What makes you so special?
So let's move into the 90s. This is the warlord era and, of course, the rise of the Taliban. And we know that we liked the warlords in Afghanistan. The Americans did. What best describes our relationship to the Taliban pre-9/11?
Well, I mean, no one less than Chuck Hogan actually came out and said the Taliban are a wholly owned subsidiary of the Pakistani ISI, Inter-Services Intelligence. Okay, so they were a creation from the very beginning. And there's a guy here locally at the Boston Globe who he was in an interview with, I think it was Madeleine Albright. And I remember he told us personally, he said, I didn't write it down at the time. He said, I wasn't recording at the time. He said, but I am sure she came out and said that the Taliban were a cleansing force for Afghanistan, that they would go in and they would get rid of all the drug dealers. They'd get rid of all the bad guys that were being employed like Gould during the 1980s, that the U.S. had pulled out of the woodwork in order to defeat the Russians. So, and that was the qualification. The fact is that the Peshawar 7, the 7 different Mujahideen groups, never got it together. They never became a political entity. They got together with the Pakistanis at one point, and they were going to do, after the Russians had left, and they tried to do an invasion and came over the mountains, and the Afghan government actually beat them back. Okay, they didn't even need the Russians at that point, and that was always a problem. During the 1980s was the fact is that the local party, the PDPA, the People's Democratic Party, was so weak and fractured that they really didn't have the authority. They didn't feel that they could hold on to the government and control the country on their own. And the fact is that the Soviets had been trying from the very beginning, even before they invaded. They had been trying to get the PDPA to back off, to put in a coalition government, to bring in other people. They were encouraging them, and that's all on the record. None of that ever made it into the New York Times or the Washington Post.
Well, I would like to add that I really think that what happened to Najibullah, I think, was a very significant sort of harbinger of what was going to come in the future. The Soviets actually were more than willing at one point, publicly acknowledging that they were more than willing to consider trying to bring the king back, okay, which is something the Afghan people actually wanted after 9/11 and were actually denied And so, you can see in terms of the American policies, they were clearly completely uninterested in really doing anything serious to bring back the sovereignty of Afghanistan. It was as if once the country was destabilized by the process they had actually entered into, everything that the U.S. was doing was ensuring it would get more destabilized in preparation for the Taliban takeover, which is what, of course, really meant Pakistan controlling Afghanistan.
And more and more tilted towards extremism.
Right.
So on that point, you brought up how like the events of December 1979, fairly earth-shattering for your world. The 1979 as a whole, and the Islamic Revolution in Iran, as well as the siege of the Kaaba in Saudi Arabia, are these other harbingers of a rising Islamist tide across both Sunni and Shia in the in the Muslim world, of different varieties and nuances, to be sure. But I'm kind of curious about how the American government's relationship, particularly in Afghanistan, with Islamists and Islamism as an ideological force, changed until you get to the Taliban. Because how does one square the circle, I suppose, of like us allying with the very people who impose these retrograde laws against women and so on?
Well, Sig Harrison actually said to us, he said, why is it that the U.S. always backs the worst people? And we're talking about, this is like 40 years ago, we're talking about these observations. So this is not a surprise at all that, again, what Chuck Hogan said to us about, he didn't care that quote, winning the Cold War and giving the Soviets their own Vietnam meant destroying Afghanistan.
Well, I think, most people don't realize the United States has been in a financial crisis since 1971 when we went off the gold standard. The cost of Vietnam was fantastic. And the Germans and the Japanese were no longer going to accept inflated dollars in payment for all the trade that they were making up for what the U.S. was pouring into Vietnam. And so as a result of that, Nixon took the U.S. off the gold standard and said, we're not going to pay you in gold. And let the dollar float. And so that's when they came over the 1970s. They came to this agreement about with the Saudis that the dollar would be supported by the price of oil and that oil would be purchased in dollars. So that was really kind of the influence that the Saudis had. And the Saudis had an enormous amount of influence with the American government. And institutionally here. They would endow someone that I know that used to work
the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy.
Well, they used to endow all of these local institutions at Harvard and whatever. I remember back in the 90s at one point that Saudi royal family took over a playground in Cambridge because their kids were going to play there. So they went and they kicked everybody out. Somebody called the police and the police called the local consulate and said, no, leave them alone. Let them take it, It was like that was the level at which they came at, the United States. And I think so in terms of markets. And you've also got the influence through BCCI, of course, the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, in which they basically financed a lot of American politicians. And I think, as you said, it's kind of like, well, let's let it rip, I think, Jack Bloom, an investigator, referred to it as rent-a-face. They came in and they rented whatever face they needed in order to get done what they wanted done in terms of legislation. They wanted to rival Israel in terms of the Arab influence on the American government. And they were willing to buy or pay anybody anything in order to get that influence, and they succeeded.
Well, there's actually... Oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
I just wanted to add a side story about the attitude of the British Empire during its involvement with Afghanistan went out of its way to try to destroy the naturally progressive, democratic-minded Afghan people. So that goes back to, Amanullah, who instituted the first constitution in 1923 that gave women the right to vote. And I'd like to add, the women didn't ask for it. They were given it. They didn't have to, go out into the streets and beg for it. So there's a lot of misunderstanding about where this problem is coming from of extremism. This was not at all natural to the Afghan people. In fact, their I think it was Alexander Burns during the 19th century was known to acknowledge the friendliness and the acceptance of the Western and Christian people by the Afghans and the hospitality and things like that. This was in the 19th century that they had this open-mindedness.
This is in the 1830s.
So you've written, and we discuss in our show, about how the flirtation or really collaboration between the United States and Pakistan and Saudi Arabia with Islamic militants inside of Afghanistan during either the Dawood era or the Marxist era. Could you talk a bit about the set of foreign powers that were at play that we were friends with, who were working these hardliners within Afghanistan, and what some of these allies of ours were like?
The Shah, I mean, the Shah was very much, he was basically put into power by the United States, by the CIA. That was there. The fact is that this sort of thing was, once again, this came from the British, this whole Islamization idea. Okay. You had some people who were, much more progressive, much more interested in helping the Afghans and third world nations develop their own democracies, indigenous democracies, which I think you'd probably say goes back to the Kennedy administration. Okay. Although Kennedy himself, of course, was fighting, these kind of right-wing conservative elements in his own administration.
Yeah.
But the fact is that, the Islamization thing, I think it's called the Benigzin School. Okay. There's a couple of different people from British intelligence who wrote up tracts about these things. I mean, I could go get the book and find you. I have it. It's back here from the 1970s. You might be interested in reading it. And basically it's, he goes in and he details the kind of people that they were aligned with. Now, this goes back into the British Empire. They would find what happened in Afghanistan was that the king would try to become more liberal, more progressive. He would be granting rights. So much of what was going on in terms of wealth in Afghanistan was based on land, and on that was basically your major source. And they were trying to do land reform so that they could redistribute some of the land to some of the around to the population, so that they wouldn't be so absolutely poor. Abject poverty was a big problem in Afghanistan, and still is, needless to say. So every time the king or Mohammed Dawood would propose land reform, the British would get on the horn. They'd send their people around Pakistan, and they would say, the king's doing it again. He's going to take your land away. He's going to take your money away. You won't be able to raise a family any longer. He's going to give your land to all those kafirs out there, all those people that don't believe, and they'd rile them up. And then they'd attack a government outpost or something like that. So that was going on in the they even sent, the British even sent Lawrence of Arabia in there in 1919 and 1918 in order to see what he could do in order to rouse the natives against the regime in Kabul in the Third Anglo-Afghan War. So you clearly had an ongoing antagonism that was coming from, a colonial power that wanted to occupy Afghanistan but couldn't do it. Yes. And no power has ever been able to sustain an occupation outside of.
I think also the story about Gulbuddin Hekmatyar is very important to bring up now, because it was 1973 when he was embraced by Pakistan.
It was during this time.
Right, it was during this time, exactly. And that he apparently, they claim, had murdered one of the party members, and he was put in jail, and I guess they had an amnesty, and he went over to Pakistan, and he was completely embraced by...
He and Masood.
And Masood, right. And so right there, you have your core relationship. And I think we mentioned, he was a Ghilzai, and Amin was a Ghilzai.
Ghilzai Pashtun.
And this meant that there was an alliance of that, and there have been competitions with the Ghilzais and the Duranis for control of Afghanistan. So you're dealing with these and how the CIA could, whichever intelligence agency was in operation at the moment,
the Safari Club
could exploit it. Oh, exactly.
But you see, the thing is that what triggered the Soviet invasion is that under Amin, Amin and Gulbuddin Hekmatyar were supposedly getting together. That was a question. That was what triggered it. That what was going to happen. So when I went there in 1981, I was interviewed this Afghan mullah who had been very high up in the government, and he had been very close to both Amin. He was considered Amin's kind of confessor, and as well as Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. And so I said, I told him, I said, he lives here in the United States now. He'd moved from Afghanistan. He was living near us, actually in Boston. So I asked him, we had him out to the house, and I said, there's been a rumor for years that this event, what triggered the Soviet invasion, was this event that was going to happen, that Hafizullah Amin had invited Gulbuddin Hekmatyar to come to Kabul, and that they were going to share the government. And Amin was going to anoint Gulbuddin Hekmatyar as the prime minister or some leading part in the government. Yes?
In other words, a coalition government, but far from the one that the Soviets were interested in.
Exactly, far from the one the Soviets wanted.
Or Adolf Dubs would have wanted.
And Dubs would have wanted. And they were going to expel the Soviets, the way the Soviets had been expelled from Egypt in 1972, I think it was. Yeah. At any rate, so that's...
that was the nightmare.
That was the nightmare. Yeah. So I said, that was actually written up in a roundtable paper from Britain. I said, shortly after the Soviet invasion, that was the cause of it. I said, is there anything to that? He said, yes, by all means. That's exactly what was planned. He said they were very close friends. They were both from the same tribe. They were both Gilzai Pashtuns, and that was going to happen. And word of it spread.
So let's speed ahead here. We've talked about the 1990s a bit. We've talked about the background in the 19th century as well as the 70s and 80s. Let's flash forward after the attacks of September 11th. How do you both think Americans should understand the U.S. goals in Afghanistan after the 9/11 attacks from 2001 onward, once we invaded?
Well, the first thing I would say is that you can never, ever base anything on who the U.S. is friends with, because at any point, Saddam Hussein, Gaddafi, they can become an enemy and be taken out. And that's the point. I think that is the basis, I believe, a lot of the motivation to basically fulfill what Sig Harrison claimed. We always go for the worst people. And what I mean, I think it's really more important that these people oftentimes, they call them extremists and they make a big deal about it. But, when you're talking about, the mob, okay, do people say, oh, the Italian mob is Catholic? They don't worry about that. They're mobsters. They're criminals. They do illegal things and they kill people and they don't care and nobody can touch them. Well, that's the same thing about these Islamists. It's not about them being extremists. It's about them being criminals. And that's the key, okay? And they find people who will sell out their country, who will sell out the people. All right. And I think that, and they also buy into, this is the sort of pan-Islamic agenda, as opposed to a sovereign local, religious connection. All right. What they do is they don't want the mullahs who are with the people or with the nation. They want the globalist. And I don't mean in the word.
Well, that's the overarching.
Right. And that's
idea.
The British agenda. That's what they really inaugurated in the 19th
century.
Well,
George Ball came out a number of years ago, in the late 60s, early 70s. And he said, he was a very high level member of a lot of American governments. And he came out and said, what we need to do is, we need a world government that is in the form of the East India Company in order to manage the world. That's the kind of government the world needs.
We seem to be there.
Corporate, we've achieved it. I think we pretty much will. And certainly with what we've seen over the last few years with executive authority just being laid out on everyone, without any question. And, you're supposed to do what you're told.
On that tip there, what do you see from your experience and your work, going back all these years now? What do you see as the major similarities or historical ironies, I guess you could say, between the Soviets' time in Afghanistan and the Americans? I mean, also major differences in their motives or their execution. What parallels do you see?
There happened to be, there was an article written, I think in the early 2000s after 9/11 called Red Cabell. You remember the name of the journalist? I can't remember.
He was a British guy.
He was a British journalist.
It's in the Guardian. It's in the Guardian.
Right, exactly. And he was there in the 1980s, and he went back. And he
Jonathan Steele. Sorry to interrupt.
Yes,
Jonathan Steele.
Exactly. You just have to read his article, okay, to actually, he did an excellent comparison of what was going on in the 1980s for the people of Afghanistan, for the women. In this time period, you had in the 70s and even into the 80s during the Soviet occupation, you had up to 60% of the students at Kabul University were women. 60%. Okay. And that was in the 70s. So that just continued into the 80s. And the whole nature of the life that was going on and the kinds of things that the Soviets had already done to help the Afghan people, with their bus systems and building apartment complexes and things like that. So it wasn't obviously all just a geopolitical military alliance. It was clearly they were dealing with the basics of helping the country develop.
They were helping them build a modern country.
So to segue into the final question I have, as of this date, we have remained withdrawn from Afghanistan. We withdrew in August 2021. And I guess I would like to hear what you guys think, because we've spoken to other guests who were critical of the war, demanded withdrawal, but are actually still pretty outraged at the withdrawal itself. What do you think of the withdrawal? What do you think about how it was executed? Now that it's been achieved, where does it leave things today?
Well, I think that the withdrawal, first of all, of course, we all know it looked like Saigon. I think the fact that it was literally, it was showing, I think, that this, again, the important thing is that we're looking at a pattern of behavior of the U.S. government. And I think it's important to remember that how Vietnam ended looked exactly the same as how Afghanistan ended. So there is something about the narrative that's put out to con the American people into accepting these invasions and whatever the potential is supposed to come out of it for the American people, obviously, that has nothing to do with the outcomes. All right. And if any good comes out of it, I'm not convinced that it was part of the plan. That is, that really is what it comes down to, that's not part of the American purpose. Okay. And that does kind of, once again, but in terms of this agenda issue, I do think that this underlying British agenda, one of the things we certainly think, was underlying, especially the initial stage of entering into Afghanistan before the actual invasion happened. The British were running the operation. We got that straight from Chuck Hogan. I mean, the Americans they couldn't actively get involved because of the limitations from the church committee hearings and things like that. So they really let the British, kind of run things.
And they weren't restricted.
And they had exactly. And they had already shown their willingness to use the criminal class. And I think it's important to think of it that way, not the, extremist class. They're criminals. That's it. Okay. And to empower them. All right. And so I think that Malaya is absolutely correct that this is a deal and that the Taliban was what they always wanted. And that's part of the Pakistani influence. And remember, the creation of Pakistan out of Afghanistan has always been a crisis for Pakistan's attitude towards Afghanistan. They always wanted to neutralize the sovereign government of Afghanistan because of that reason. They were afraid, obviously, that there may be, we're going to be able to stir up some interest in challenging the Durand Line, resolution.
We were speaking with someone many years ago and, explaining our exasperation at why things didn't make sense. And he was very well connected and he said, believe me, it's all internally consistent. So that was the word, those were the words for internally consistent. Whatever it looks like on the outside is just confusion. It's chaff that gets put out in order to confuse you so that you can't solve the problem.
Right. I wanted a quick comparison. Zolmay Khalilzad, who was the U.S. representative for Afghanistan, who, if anyone doesn't know it, he's an Afghan. Okay. He is the one who was personally responsible for ignoring the jirga that the Afghans had determined to get the king back after 9/11 when they had the Bonn conference. And our very dear friend Seema Wali was one of the 3 representatives that was there at the Bonn conference setting up the new government. They were completely cut off. Khalilzad went out of his way as an Afghan because he was clearly influenced by the Chicago school. I mean, we know he was very much influenced by the whole neocon agenda. So he was no longer representing the interests of the Afghan people. And I do think that this point I make, because way back when the Soviets were trying to get solutions for the Afghan crisis, they offered to bring the king back. So this is simply a fact. So the American representative denies the Afghan people what they specifically asked for, and the Soviets were willing to help them get the king back. I mean, these are facts that people have to take in.
Well, Elizabeth Gould, Paul Fitzgerald, this was a wonderful conversation. We are very grateful you've been able to make the time, and again, we're very much indebted to your book and your work in general for the show. So thank you again for coming on.
Thank you.
Terrific.
And to everyone listening, we'll see you next time.